Look, I'm not a wilderness guy. I like AC, Wi-Fi, and not being eaten alive. That's how this whole mess started. If you live in Grandview Heights, USA, you know our summer humidity isn't just oppressive. It's practically a breeding program for mosquitoes. They were so thick they looked less like insects and more like a tiny gray fog of hate descending on my backyard every evening. You couldn't sit outside after 6 p.m. without applying enough DEET to qualify as a hazardous materials event. I'm a programmer, which means my natural response to a physical problem is to find a digital solution. I quickly learned that the digital solution for mosquitoes is either a $500 bug zapper that just makes noise, or bats. Specifically, bats eat thousands of the little bloodsuckers every night. A natural, chemical-free, almost passive solution. Perfect. I found a plan online for a multi-chamber bat house. Most plans call for something small, subtle, maybe 12 inches wide. But the plan I found, well, let's just say it was optimized for colony-level habitation. I didn't want to mess around. If I was going to invite nature to solve my problem, I wanted a solution that delivered results. I wanted a bat city. The DIY process was, as expected, a nightmare. I spent an entire Saturday battling wood, nails, and geometry, cursing every time the instructions used a phrase like, "align the grain seamlessly." I'm a wizard with Python. I'm a barbarian with a hammer. The final result was less rustic charm and more what I'd call brutalist birdhouse. It was tall, dark brown, and frankly a bit aggressive. It looked like a tiny wooden modernist skyscraper for nocturnal flying mammals. But it was functional. I mounted it on a tall post at the edge of my yard, near the big oak tree. I wiped the sweat off my brow and declared victory over the insect kingdom. For 3 glorious weeks, nothing happened. No bats, but also fewer mosquitoes. Hope was flickering. I was winning a quiet, suburban war against the buzzing horde. Then the mail arrived. It wasn't just a letter. It was an artifact. Thick, cream-colored paper, sealed with a fancy little sticker that Leo instantly described as the dried tears of neighborhood joy. It was from the Grandview Heights Homeowners Association, of course, my personal municipal tormentors. I ripped it open. The letter was a masterpiece of bureaucratic passive aggression. It was titled, "Notice of Architectural and Covenant Violation. Third-party report." Oh, a third party reported me? I already knew it was Mrs. Beatrice Sterling, the HOA president, because she is the only person in Grandview Heights who capitalizes the word structure on an envelope. The violation read, "Violation, cited, installation of an unapproved exterior structure in violation of Covenant 4.3b, concerning non-standard, non-decorative roofline projection and unnatural color palette. Selection, dark taupe. Action required, immediate dismantling and toilettes. Removal of said structure from the premises within 7 days of receipt of this notice. Failure to comply will result in escalating fines and potential legal action." I read it 3 times. A non-standard, non-decorative roofline projection. That's how they referred to a small habitat for endangered species. The absurdity of it made my blood boil, which is exactly what the mosquitoes did, but slower. Unnatural color palette selection? It was brown, like a tree. Had Mrs. Sterling never seen nature? Or maybe she preferred everything painted HOA-approved soft beige. My immediate reaction was pure, undiluted disbelief. They wanted me to take down my perfectly fine, slightly oversized brutalist bat box? No. I paced my living room, arguing with the inanimate piece of paper. I am providing housing for wildlife. I am conducting pest control. I am reducing the community's environmental footprint, I yelled, knowing full well the letter couldn't hear me and didn't care anyway. I vowed then and there I wouldn't take it down. It was a matter of principle. The principle of not being dictated to about the contents of my own yard by a woman whose primary personality trait was a deep, abiding love for bylaws. In a fit of dramatic rage, I crumpled the letter into a ball and slam-dunked it into the kitchen trash can. Wait, if I left it in the trash, I might forget the exact violation number, and Mrs. Sterling was definitely the kind of person who checked the trash to ensure compliance. I immediately retrieved the letter, smoothing out the cream-colored wrinkles. I realized the 7-day countdown had started. Mrs. Sterling wasn't just coming for the bat house, she was coming for me. And she was using the full, terrifying power of suburban bureaucracy to do it. The game was on. The next day, a second letter arrived. It was an invitation, or rather, a summons, a mandatory architectural compliance review. My blood pressure spiked immediately. I was being called before the Grandview Heights Inquisition. I immediately called Frank, my best friend, who understands my specific brand of cynical chaos. Frank is usually the voice of reason, though he finds my misery deeply entertaining. Dude, they want me to come to the HOA meeting. The mandatory review, I said, my voice tight. Frank was clearly chewing something crunchy. Did you take down the Bat Hut of Doom yet? No, I told you, it's the principle of the thing. I'm going to go there and explain the complex ecological science behind my non-standard roofline projection. Frank sighed, a noise that sounded like a tire deflating slowly. Just spray-painted beige, Leo. Nobody wants a war with the Sterling. That woman could audit the concept of fun. I can't. This is about the principle of having a slightly disproportionate wooden box in my yard. And besides, the brown is crucial for thermal absorption. It's scientifically sound. It's brown, Leo. Just brown. Look, if you're going, go in peace. Maybe bring a fruit basket. I'm bringing charts, Frank, and a righteous attitude. Wish me luck. Good luck. Don't get fined into oblivion. Frank hung up, probably laughing. The confrontation was set in the sterile HOA clubhouse. I walked into that room and immediately felt my soul shrivel. The carpet was that awful corporate blue-gray. The air smelled faintly of lemon polish and suppressed rage. And there, seated at the head of a mahogany table polished to a frightening sheen, was Mrs. Sterling. She wore a blazer the color of a mild headache, and her expression suggested I was actively ruining the value of her own property just by existing within a 2-mile radius. I used my most exaggerated internal descriptions of the room and the antagonist. The fluorescent lights hummed a low, threatening note. The wall decor consisted of framed photographs of flower beds that had won Yard of the Quarter. Mrs. Sterling didn't just sit. She reigned. The proceedings were dialogue-driven, dry, and utterly ridiculous. Mr. Maxwell, Mrs. Sterling began, not looking up from a meticulously organized stack of papers. We are here to confirm your immediate compliance with the violation notice regarding the structure you have placed on your property, Lot 14B. Yes, Mrs. Sterling. I received the notice, I replied, trying to sound as reasonable as possible, which, for me, sounded suspiciously like sarcasm. She finally looked up, her gaze colder than the inside of a meat locker. And have you taken action to remove the unauthorized structure, as required by Covenant 4.3b? No, ma'am, I have not. And with respect, I believe the covenant is misapplied. The structure is an essential piece of environmental infrastructure. It's a bat house. A bat house, she repeated slowly, as if the words were foreign objects she was inspecting for contamination. Mr. Maxwell, the architectural guidelines clearly state that all exterior projections must be decorative, proportional to the dwelling, and approved by the committee prior to installation. I leaned forward. But it's a natural pest deterrent. It's green. It's practically a miniature ecosystem management system. It serves a greater purpose than a tacky bird bath, which, by the way, I see 3 of in Mrs. Peterson's yard, and they are definitely non-standard. Mrs. Sterling raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. The Grandview Heights Architectural Committee does not concern itself with miniature ecosystem management, Mr. Maxwell. It concerns itself with property values and uniformity. Furthermore, the term bat house suggests you are deliberately attracting, and this is a direct quote from a constituent, winged rodents of the night. Is that accurate? I almost laughed. They're migratory insectivores, ma'am. They are helping us all. They are our neighbors. Our neighbors are required to comply with the bylaws, she said, tapping the violation notice sharply. The structure is unapproved, disproportionate, and attracts undesirable wildlife. You have 72 hours, Mr. Maxwell. Failure to comply will result in a $100 per diem fine, effective immediately. I sat back, defeated. Arguing logic was futile. I had brought science to a bureaucracy fight, and bureaucracy always wins. I stood up, knowing I had to retreat, but not without one final, snarky exit. Very well, Mrs. Sterling. I understand. You've made it perfectly clear that the Grandview Heights Homeowners Association is fundamentally anti-nature. I'll leave you to your Yard of the Month photos and your continued battle against anything that moves, flies, or attempts to make this neighborhood a slightly better place to live. I delivered a mock salute and walked out. She didn't respond, but I could feel her laser-like glare burning a hole through my spine. Driving home, I was furious. But then, the fury morphed into something far more dangerous. Inspiration. Mrs. Sterling had used the language of rules against me. I realized I couldn't win by being logical or nice. I had to win by being official. The small, ugly brown bat house needed an intimidating disguise. I thought about the Audubon Society, a name that sounds instantly respectable, ecological, and most importantly, too important to question. Internal monologue. They want me to take down an unapproved bat house? Fine. But they can't touch a federally recognized, ecologically crucial, internationally sponsored, highly scientific Audubon Society Research Station. The idea was born in a single, beautiful moment of pure, motivated spite. The moment I got back inside, I locked the door and called Frank. This required a strategy session, or what I like to call convincing Frank to enable my worst impulses. Frank, I stated, skipping the pleasantries, we have moved past the principal phase. We are now in the performance art phase. Oh, God. You got fined, didn't you? Frank asked, already sounding exhausted. Minor inconvenience, but Mrs. Sterling made a critical error. She failed to respect the inherent authority of scientific research. I laid out the plan. I explained the concept of transforming the bat house into a research station. Frank was silent for a full 5 seconds. Wait, so you're going to lie to a governing body by using the name of a respected wildlife conservation group to protect a wooden box? No, Frank. I'm going to leverage the inherent bureaucratic paralysis that occurs when suburban tyranny meets genuine, but fabricated scientific mission statements. I felt like I should be giving a TED Talk. That is the most ridiculously you thing I've ever heard. You're going to get sued. They can't sue science, Frank. They can only question zoning. And the moment they question the zoning of an Audubon Society research station, they move the battleground from exterior projection to impeding ecological study. That's a fight they can't win. We debated the logistics. The most important component, obviously, was the sign. It had to look utterly official. It needs to be bigger than the bat house itself, Frank suggested. Like, comically bigger. Comically? No. Intimidatingly, I corrected. It needs to be visible from space, but legible only to the highly educated. It needs to look like it belongs at a remote Arctic testing facility, not next to a rhododendron. We agreed on the aesthetics. Institutional gray. High-quality aluminum. And the font? Needs Helvetica, Frank. The font of absolute, cold, unfeeling, bureaucratic authority. I spent the rest of the day in the research phase. Fake officialism. My background as a programmer made this part easy. It was just data input, but instead of code, it was pretentious jargon. I needed a mission statement that sounded crucial, non-negotiable, and completely incomprehensible to Mrs. Sterling. I settled on the project title. Project Nocturne, Phase 4, Microchiropteran Habitat and Migratory Pattern Analysis. Phase 4 suggests years of prior, unquestionable research. Microchiropteran sounds infinitely more legitimate than bat. The mission statement I drafted was beautiful in its complexity. To assess the efficacy of controlled, thermally optimized vertical habitats within the Grandview Metropolitan Suburban Corridor, providing longitudinal data for future species-specific conservation architecture and acoustic signature analysis. Pure poetry. It meant absolutely nothing concrete, but it sounded like the kind of thing you'd need a $5 million grant to even read. I designed the sign meticulously. It needed the elements of pure authority. The title, Audubon Society, Grandview Field Station. The project, Project Nocturne, Phase 4, in small technical script. The funding, a fake grant funded by line, the Regional Ecological Fund, in partnership with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife. The latter was a nice touch of fake federal authority. The warning. A stern warning in bold red text at the bottom. Unauthorized access and interference with federal wildlife research protocols is a severe violation. 24 HR camera surveillance. I also finalized a tiny physical addition to the bat house itself. It needed to look instrumented. I took an old TV antenna, spray-painted it matte black, and rigged it to the top of the brutalist birdhouse, adding a cheap, rotating plastic weather vane on the end. Now it looked like it was monitoring something very important. My internal monologue was practically shouting, "This isn't about bats anymore. This is performance art." And the HOA just bought a front-row seat. They created a monster of bureaucratic resistance, and I was happy to give them the show. I finalized the specs for the sign. It wasn't 6 feet tall. It was 1.83 meters tall, professional grade, 125 gauge aluminum. Time to find a contractor who could handle this kind of chaos. I knew immediately I couldn't use a suburban FedEx Kinko's for this job. I needed someone who understood the difference between a sign and a declaration of war. I found Big Tony's Sign Solutions tucked away in an industrial park, smelling of vinyl, paint thinner, and a generalized skepticism toward the human condition. Big Tony Moretti was exactly as advertised. a large man in a faded work shirt who looked like he could personally lift the 6-foot sign I was ordering. He was chewing a cigar that looked permanently unlit, and his eyes narrowed as I handed him the design file. The interaction was peak hilarity. "What is this?" Tony grunted, holding the design up to the fluorescent light. He scanned the dense, scientific-sounding text. "That, Mr. Moretti, is the schematics for an authorized piece of ecological infrastructure." I maintained my facade of professional, quiet urgency. He pointed to the Audubon Society logo, which I'd downloaded and slightly stylized. "And you got the rights to this? They know you're putting up a sign that says Project Nocturne?" "It's a field station, Mr. Moretti. Extremely sensitive. We operate under a tight, non-disclosure agreement with our regional grant providers. We need this to look official, imposing, non-negotiable. I need the highest quality vinyl, UV protected, mounted on galvanized steel." Tony looked from the design to my suburban polo shirt and back. He slowly took the cigar out of his mouth. "Son, you paying cash? 'Cause this looks like the kind of sign you put up 5 minutes before the divorce papers hit the mailbox. Or before the IRS shows up." "I'm paying cash, Mr. Moretti. I assure you this is highly sensitive ecological research. We need it to be permanent." I pushed the deposit across the counter. Tony shrugged, a movement that shifted a surprising amount of mass. He seemed less suspicious and more amused. "You want the sturdiest ground mount. I got a pneumatic driver. It'll be easier to move your whole house than this sign, kid." "Perfect, Tony. That's exactly the level of permanence I require." He grunted again, a sound of reluctant approval. 3 days. Don't call me. I'll call you." 3 days later was installation day chaos. It wasn't subtle. Big Tony and his 2 crew members rolled up in a massive, noisy pickup truck that looked like it had been wrestling bulldozers all morning. They had industrial equipment, including the aforementioned pneumatic driver, which looked less like a tool and more like a miniature cannon. The neighbors were immediately curious. A few people peered from behind their curtains. Mrs. Sterling, however, was in a full-blown state of tactical alert. I saw her shadow dart behind her blinds. She was monitoring the situation like a Soviet radar operator. The installation was a full-blown spectacle in the quiet suburb. The crew drilled a deep, wide hole. The pneumatic driver hammered the steel post into the ground with concussive, authoritative thuds that echoed across the perfectly manicured lawns of Grandview Heights. Then, the massive sign, the institutional gray monolith, was unrolled and bolted to the steel pole. It towered over my 1-story house. It completely, utterly dwarfed the original bat house, now officially the primary habitat module, which sat humbly a few feet away, topped by its new, ridiculous antenna. The dialogue during this spectacle was fantastic. One of Tony's crew members, a burly guy named Sal, yelled to me over the noise of the drill. "What did this thing do? Cure cancer or something?" "It controls mosquitoes, Sal," I yelled back, "and it's deeply offensive to local bureaucracy." Sal laughed, a great booming sound. "Best kind of job. Tony, you see the old lady across the street? She's taking pictures." Tony walked over, wiping sweat from his brow. He looked at the towering, official, and utterly out-of-place sign. He looked at Mrs. Sterling's house. "That old lady across the street?" Tony said, grinning slightly, the unlit cigar bobbing. "She looks like she just swallowed a bee. 5-star job, kid. This thing ain't going nowhere. It's official now." "Thank you, Tony. You've done a great service to science," I said, handing him the final payment. "Nah, kid. I done a great service to spite. Looks like I'll be getting a call from a lawyer about this too, though. You keep my number handy." As Tony and his crew drove off, leaving behind a perfectly pristine, highly scientific monument in my front yard, the silence felt heavy. The sign stood alone. A Declaration of Independence dropped in the middle of a totalitarian flower bed. I immediately took a photo, zoomed out for maximum effect, and sent it to Frank with a simple message. Mission accomplished. Now we wait for the tactical nuclear strike. I knew this was only the opening salvo. Mrs. Sterling would not rest. The monolith was too big, too gray, and too aggressively official to be ignored. The HOA had to escalate, and I was ready. The tactical nuclear strike arrived not in the form of an HOA violation, but as a bewildered public servant. Mrs. Sterling, unable to get the HOA board to issue a $5,000 fine against an entity that claimed to be the Audubon Society, had gone higher. She hadn't called the real Audubon Society. She was too afraid of confirming my fake affiliation. So she called the City Code Enforcement, claiming the aluminum behemoth was a new, larger, unapproved structure. A supersized sign requiring a $500 city permit. Code Enforcement, however, quickly realized the sign wasn't advertising plumbing services. It was citing obscure federal wildlife research. They couldn't determine jurisdiction. Was it a sign? Was it scientific infrastructure? Was it a protected federal research facility? Bureaucracy seized up completely. They did the only thing a confused government agency can do. They punted it to the local police department as a potential public nuisance. A few hours later, Officer Miller arrived. I saw the patrol car pull up. It was late afternoon. Officer Miller was a weary, perpetually confused man who looked like he'd rather be directing traffic than mediating a dispute over yard decor. He looked completely miserable, carrying a clipboard that looked 2 sizes too large for the situation. I stepped out of my house, adopting my new persona, Dr. Leo Maxwell, Site Director, Project Nocturne. I was calm, professional, and slightly grave. "Good afternoon, officer," I said, extending a hand. "I'm Dr. Maxwell, director of the Grandview Field Station. Are you here on the matter of the constituent complaint regarding our Phase 4 installation?" Officer Miller blinked at me, shaking my hand awkwardly. Yeah, Mr. Maxwell. I'm Officer Miller. I'm just here to look at the situation. Ma'am called it harassment by aluminum, said it was a public eyesore. I understand the visual contrast may be jarring to some, I said, gesturing towards the towering institutional sign. But I must advise you, officer, that this site is now under the operational guidelines of the Regional Ecological Fund. Interfering with active, federally tracked chiropteran architectural ecology research is a severe violation. I watched the color drain slightly from his face. He fumbled with his clipboard. "Federally tracked, you say?" "Absolutely," I confirmed, nodding gravely. "Are you familiar with Title III, Section 7 of the U.S. Wildlife Preservation Act?" I completely made up the title and section, of course, giving it that beautiful ring of made-up authority. Officer Miller just stared at the sign's aggressive red warning text about unauthorized access. He was clearly thinking, I signed up to write parking tickets, not tangle with the feds over a giant bat sign. "So the Audubon Society," Officer Miller tried again, sweating slightly. "Is this like a branch office? Do you have an HQ contact number I can verify this mission with?" I adopted a confidential, low tone. "Officer, I appreciate your diligence, but the nature of Project Nocturne requires extreme discretion. We're working on the nocturnal acoustic signature analysis of the local Myotis septentrionalis population. High-level stuff. We track migratory routes across state lines. I can't elaborate on the specifics without a security clearance." I paused for dramatic effect. "To put it simply, officer, my contact is a private satellite phone number monitored by the Regional Ecological Fund. If you call it, they will ask you for a Level 4 cryptography key. I highly recommend you don't." He ran a hand over his crew cut. Eyes were darting from the sign to the sky, as if expecting a secret government helicopter to descend. "Look, Mr. Maxwell, I'm a traffic guy. I don't know what a myotis is, but it sounds important. Can you show me a permit for the sign size? That's typically a city regulation." "Ah, the permit," I said, clicking my tongue. "Research exemption, officer. The entire structure, including the directional informational plaque, the sign, is classified as essential infrastructure for data collection and public outreach. The city cannot require a permit for necessary scientific instrumentation." I pointed to the weather vane on the bat house. "See that micro antenna? That's beaming data on optimal habitat temperatures right now. Removing the sign could be construed as tampering with the facility." Officer Miller sighed deeply, the sound of a man who realized he was trapped in a bureaucratic nightmare far above his pay grade. He scribbled something illegible on his clipboard. "All right, Mr. Maxwell. I'm writing down. Site visit completed. Structure appears to be part of a legitimate, ongoing federal research initiative. Advised constituent to contact the appropriate environmental authority for further clarification. Will that suffice?" "That is an impeccable report, officer," I said, giving him a curt, professional nod. He got back into his cruiser, defeated, muttering something I barely caught about having to write a report on alleged bat espionage. He drove away, leaving me victorious in the face of both the HOA and the local police force. The sheer audacity had worked. Officer Miller's report, however vague, had to be filed. And in a town as small as Grandview Heights, bureaucratic drama bleeds into public gossip fast. Frank, my loyal accomplice, had done his part. He had posted the photo of the towering, intimidating research station alongside Mrs. Sterling's original, unapproved exterior structure violation letter on a local neighborhood forum. The title was perfect. HOA attempts to evict science, gets metaphysically owned. The response was immediate and glorious. It exploded locally. The narrative was framed exactly as I wanted. The poor, hard-working scientist fighting the small-minded, tyrannical HOA. The public, tired of being fined for unapproved lawn gnomes and improperly mulched flower beds, rallied to my cause. People started leaving funny, small tokens near the sign. I woke up one morning to find a plastic beaker taped to the post, filled with water and a twig. Another time, there was a tiny plush bat hanging from the grant-funded buy line. Someone had even managed to print a blurry, fake, official government seal sticker and affix it to the aluminum. The support was intoxicating. It was the purest form of suburban revolt. A young, earnest reporter named Sarah from the Grandview Gazette quickly caught the scent of a fantastic local interest story. She called me, asking for an interview. This was my chance to escalate the propaganda. She showed up with a small camera crew, a kid who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. I greeted them at the front door, wearing my cleanest polo and maintaining my grave, scientific demeanor. The interview was pure gold. "Mr. Maxwell," Sarah began, holding a microphone with the Gazette logo on it. "This is fascinating. Can you explain the crucial Phase 4 objectives of Project Nocturne and why the Bat House, which you now call the primary habitat module, is slightly lopsided? I gave a deeply technical, completely fabricated explanation of the lopsidedness, speaking slowly and deliberately. That's intentional, Sarah, I explained, pointing to the structure. It's what we call a controlled microtilt for optimized directional heat retention and egress vectoring. Sarah's eyes widened slightly. The cameraman stifled a laugh. I continued, leaning in for emphasis. If the module is perfectly level, the temperature gradient for the juvenile colonies is uniform, which skews the data. The microtilt allows for the study of thermodynamic efficiency in a controlled suburban microclimate. It's crucial data for the future of urban chiropteran architecture. The Grandview Heights location is actually a control group for a much larger study in downtown Cincinnati. Sarah was clearly trying to figure out if I was a genius or a lunatic, but she had to go with the former. And the HOA's demands? How has that impacted your research? I shifted the tone to a subtle, wounded professionalism. It's a tragedy, frankly. We are dedicated to the environmental health of this community. Mosquitoes are a public health risk. The bats are the solution. And it's a tragedy that a simple aluminum sign is the only thing protecting us from bureaucratic eradication. I added the final perfect rhetorical flourish. The public deserves to be protected from mosquitoes, and the bats deserve the highest level of architectural fidelity. We urge the Grandview Heights Homeowners Association to put public safety and ecological commitment ahead of their arbitrary aesthetic preference for beige. The interview ran on the 6 o'clock news. I was an instant local legend. The backlash from the HOA was swift, desperate, and televised. The HOA held an emergency press briefing, attended by Sarah and the same grumpy cameraman. I watched it from my couch, sipping a cold soda. Mrs. Sterling was incandescent with fury, but trying desperately to maintain composure. She looked like a tea kettle about to blow its lid. "Mr. Maxwell is engaged in malicious misrepresentation," she hissed into the microphone. "This is a matter of zoning, not zoology. He is an amateur provocateur, not an environmentalist. The Audubon Society has confirmed they have no knowledge of a Project Nocturne in this area, and we will be presenting evidence to the City Planning Commission that this structure is nothing more than an overgrown, unpermitted sign." She announced the date of a formal city hearing, the final showdown, the climax. I realized her attempt to discredit me by contacting the real Audubon Society had only revealed that my lie was just big enough to be dangerous, but not big enough to warrant an immediate cease and desist from the actual organization. They probably assumed it was just local mischief. I smiled. The final boss fight was scheduled. Time to prepare the data. The day of the City Planning Commission hearing arrived. This was it. The legal bureaucratic fight I had expertly engineered. The stakes were high, the destruction of the glorious monolith of spite and the onset of those devastating $100 per diem fines. Leo spent the morning creating his case, which was essentially a work of high-level scientific fiction. I printed massive glossy charts that showed complex, totally meaningless data. Bat egress vectoring flow chart, Suburban Thermal Absorption Index, STAI, and a terrifying-looking spreadsheet tracking the non-existent Phase 1, 2, and 3 milestones. I even highlighted a passage in a printout of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife website that didn't exist, using a bright pink highlighter. Frank, bless his cynical heart, accompanied me, acting as my legal counsel, chief pep talker. Just remember the character, Leo. Grave, solemn, like you're discussing the budget deficit with the president. Frank whispered as we entered the municipal building. "I got this. I'm an expert now. I've read 5 Wikipedia articles on bat ecology, and I've fabricated 3 different federal regulations. I'm basically Dr. Jane Goodall, but with more resentment toward HOAs." The room was drab, sterile, and slightly too warm. 3 commission members sat behind a long table, looking bored and completely overwhelmed by the subject matter. Mrs. Sterling was seated at a table near the front, flanked by the 2 other most rule-obsessed members of the HOA board. She was radiating pure, contained rage, wearing a sharp suit that looked like it could cut glass. The hearing commenced. The commission head, Mr. Jenkins, summarized the issue with a tired voice. "So, Mr. Maxwell, the city's concern, brought forward by the Grandview Heights HOA, is the height and non-conforming design of this station. They claim it is a sign that violates City Ordinance 54C, which limits yard signage to 24 square feet." My moment. I approached the podium, placed my charts on easels, and began my masterful 10-minute presentation full of conviction and jargon. Commissioners, with respect, to call this essential infrastructure a sign is akin to calling the Hubble telescope a really fancy camera. This is not a sign. It is the directional informational plaque, a necessary ancillary component of the microchiropteran habitat and migratory pattern analysis station. The threat isn't the height. The threat is ecological blindness. I pointed to my charts. We are mapping the migratory paths of the Myotis septentrionalis within the Grandview Metropolitan Suburban Corridor. The directional plaque's height is crucial for visual data acquisition for the field staff and for optimal signal transmission to the main Audubon network. I then launched into a detailed, fabricated story about how Phase 4 was crucial for finding a non-toxic replacement for DDT, and how removing the plaque would invalidate 3 years of preliminary thermal data. Mrs. Sterling, unable to contain herself, slammed her hand on the table, making the commissioners jump. "He's a fraud!" she shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at me. "Mr. Jenkins, commissioners, he has provided no documentation. He is a private citizen. I demand he prove his affiliation with the Audubon Society. Show us the official charter, Mr. Maxwell. Show us the grant." Mr. Jenkins sighed, looking from Mrs. Sterling's face to my impossibly serious one. "Mr. Maxwell, do you have any official notarized documentation that verifies your affiliation or the official grant status of this Project Nocturne?" I hesitated, pulling a very official-looking but completely blank liability waiver from my folder. I was about to launch into a speech about sensitive field operations when it happened. A sudden, sharp cry interrupted me. A shadow flitted through the room, close to the ceiling lights. A single, lost but entirely real bat had flown into the municipal building, perhaps attracted by the noise, or maybe sensing its champion was in peril. Chaos erupted. People gasped. The 2 junior HOA members screamed and scrambled under their table. Most importantly, Mrs. Sterling let out a high-pitched shriek and ducked completely behind her seat. Mr. Jenkins, the commission head, yelled, "What in the heavens is that?" I seized the moment, maintaining my absolute composure, my face radiating scientific triumph. I pointed at the airborne mammal, which was frantically circling the lights. "Ah, excellent timing, commissioners," I announced loudly, my voice echoing in the sudden silence. "You see, the data is confirming my premise. That is Subject A7, demonstrating the Phase 4 egress avoidance protocol under duress. The bat is seeking a thermally stable, high-altitude navigational point. This entire hearing is now a live field experiment." The commissioners were completely rattled. They weren't thinking about zoning anymore. They were thinking about rabies and wildlife management. Mr. Jenkins grabbed his gavel. "Order! Order! I think we need to table this motion immediately," he stammered, pointing frantically at the ceiling. "We cannot continue with flying specimens in the room." They adjourned the hearing instantly, scrambling out of the room. I retrieved my charts, nodded curtly to the still hiding Mrs. Sterling, and walked out, victorious by the grace of a confused, tiny winged insectivore. I had won the battle not with truth, but with overwhelming, perfectly timed, and highly dramatic absurdity. A week later, the City Planning Commission sent Leo a letter. It didn't explicitly approve the sign or the bat house, but it did create a brand new category for my situation. Exempt educational outreach infrastructure. The approval came with a single, passive-aggressive caveat. The infrastructure must be kept clean and silent. I had effectively created a legal loophole so specific it only applied to my own property. I knew I won by being more absurd than the system was petty. The monolith of spite stayed. The fines never materialized. Mrs. Sterling, however, never truly accepted defeat. She couldn't win the battle, but she could still passive-aggressively wage the war. I frequently found mulch from her garden mysteriously pushed a foot onto my lawn, or a single rogue bottle cap left precisely 3 inches outside my mailbox. She never spoke to me again, communicating only through tightly controlled glares. The victory, however, was sweet. The bats did eventually show up, probably attracted by the warmth and the massive protective sign promising scientific importance. They solved my mosquito problem completely. A month later, a small, official-looking package arrived from Big Tony's Sign Solutions. It contained a novelty check for $1,000, signed by Tony, with the memo line reading, "Consulting fee, advanced bureaucracy evasion." I framed it. I reflect on the final state of the house. The towering institutional gray sign now stands as a monument to the ridiculousness of suburban control. The small, ugly bat house next to it, with its absurd little antenna, is finally a home. I started this because of mosquitoes. I ended it because of spite. Turns out, the fastest way to get your ridiculous project approved in this country isn't by being right. It's by wrapping it in enough official-sounding nonsense that nobody dares question it. My name is Leo Maxwell, and I'm the director of the Grandview Heights Microchiropteran Habitat and Migratory Pattern Analysis Station. Try and take that down. I grab a cold beer, walk out to my perfectly mosquito-free lawn, and toast my strange, beautiful, permanent monument to spite. The sound of 1,000 tiny, happy bats leaving their primary habitat module for their nocturnal feeding run is the only applause I need.